Welcome to the deep dive. We got a lot of clinical sources you sent over, all focused on, well, a really pressing issue today. Our mission. Cut straight to the insights you can use. And today we're tearing apart a head-to-head study comparing the two main spectacle lenses for myopia control. This is so important because, honestly, the scale of the myopia problem is just staggering, especially somewhere like Europe. Our sources, they reckon about 22.6% of kids and teens in Europe already have myopia. But the forecast, it's pretty scary. They're projecting maybe 63% of the entire European population could be myopic by 2050. I mean, this isn't just needing glasses anymore. It's a public health crisis. We need to know what works.
Absolutely. And when we talk about non-invasive options, these optical lenses, two names keep coming up. You've got defocus incorporated, multiple segments, DIMS, that's Hoya's MioSmart, and then highly aspherical lenslets, HAL, which is the tech in Essilor's Stellest.
Right.
And the real gap this study fills, it's about confidence for clinicians, applicability. For a long time, comparing DIMS and HAL directly, well, that research was mostly done in China and often just gave us 1 year of data. So our job today is to unpack the solid 2-year results, but specifically from a European group of kids. This really shifts things from theory to real-world performance right here.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Before we jump into the results, which sound pretty significant, maybe we should quickly cover the basics. How do these lenses actually work?
Sure. So fundamentally, they both use the same core idea, peripheral myopic defocus. The aim isn't just clear central vision. It's about sending a specific signal to the periphery of the eye, basically telling it, hey, slow down the growth.
Right, the stop growing signal.
Exactly. But, and this is where the engineering is pretty cool, they achieve that signal quite differently. Let's take DIMS first. It has a clear central zone, for distance vision. But around that, there's this ring, this peripheral area, and it's filled with these tiny 1 millimeter lenslets, lots of them. Each one adds a fixed plus 3.5 diopters of defocus. So the eye gets these sharp, specific defocus points.
Okay, so like a grid of little power bumps. What about HAL? How's that different?
HAL uses, a more complex approach, I'd say. No discrete spots. Instead, it has 11 concentric rings made of continuous aspherical lenslets. The idea there is to create not just points, but a whole volume of myopic defocus in front of the retina. So you see the difference. DIMS is fixed dots. HAL aims for a continuous defocus field.
That's a really clear distinction. Okay, fascinating tech. Now, how did they test these two different approaches? What was the study setup?
So this was a retrospective cohort study, really valuable because it's looking back at real-world data. It was done at a pediatric ophthalmology clinic in Milan, Italy. They looked at European kids and teens, aged 6 to 17, who'd been wearing either DIMS or HAL lenses continuously for at least 2 full years.
Okay, real patients, real clinic, 2 years minimum wear. And what were they measuring? What were the key outcomes?
The two main things, the gold standards, really. First, spherical equivalent refraction, or SER. That tracks the prescription change, measured in diopters. Second was axial length, AL. That's the physical lengthening of the eye, measured in millimeters. And crucially, they used cycloplegic autofraction for the SER checks at follow-up.
Ah, cycloplegia. Can you just remind us why that's so important, especially with kids?
Yeah, it's absolutely key for accuracy. Cycloplegia temporarily relaxes the eye's focusing muscle, the ciliary muscle. Kids can unconsciously accommodate or focus quite strongly, which can mask their true refractive error. If you don't use cycloplegia, you might get a misleading measurement. Using it ensures you're measuring the real underlying prescription change, not their focusing effort.
Got it. So good clinical practice is built in. Now, you mentioned something about the statistics earlier. They didn't just look for a difference. They used equivalence testing.
Yeah.
Why is that distinction important here?
Yes. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting parts of the method. Standard testing asks, is A better than B? Equivalence testing flips it. It asks, are A and B the same? Or rather similar enough within a preset, clinically meaningful margin. It's a much higher bar. Think of it like trying to prove a generic drug works just as well as the brand name. You have to show the difference is tiny.
So it wasn't enough for the difference not to be statistically significant. They had to actively prove the difference was so small, it fell within that tight tolerance they decided on beforehand.
Precisely. Like for the prescription change, the SER, at 1 year, that margin was just plus or minus 0.25 diopters. For eye length, AL, even tighter, plus or minus 0.20 millimeters. Proving that is much harder.
Okay, super rigorous approach then. So given all that, what was the big takeaway? What did 2 years of data show about DIMS versus HAL on average?
The headline result, It's pretty powerful for anyone prescribing these lenses. Basically, DIMS and HAL were found to be equivalent. They were essentially just as good as each other at slowing down both the prescription worsening, the SER, and the eye stretching, the AL elongation, over the full 2 years in this European group. Neither one came out clearly superior on average.
Equivalent. Okay, let's put some numbers on that. What were the average changes after 2 years?
Right, so after 2 years for the DIMS group, the average prescription change, the SER, was 1.50 diopters. For the HAL group, it was 1.63 diopters, very close. And for the eye length, the AL increase, it was 0.29 millimeters for DIMS and 0.32 millimeters for HAL. Again, remarkably similar. And when you run the equivalence tests on those 2-year numbers, the differences just weren't clinically or statistically significant. The p-values were all comfortably above that 0.05 level.
Sounds like a clear draw then, on average. But I seem to recall a tiny detail, a nuance about the equivalence testing itself. Did they meet the strict criteria at every single time point?
Ah, good catch. Almost, but not quite perfectly, which actually highlights how strict that testing is. At the 1-year mark, specifically for axial length, they technically didn't meet equivalence. The upper limit of the confidence interval was 0.21 millimeters. That just nudged over the preset limit of 0.20 millimeters. So by that very strict definition, they weren't equivalent for AL at 1 year, just barely missed it.
Wow, that's splitting hairs, but statistically important.
It is. But importantly, by the 2-year mark, they were well within the equivalent zone again for both SER and AL.
Okay, so overall, long-term average performance is equivalent. That gives clinicians choices, which is great.
Yeah.
But if the average is the same, how does a clinician decide? This is where it gets really interesting, right? Looking beyond the averages.
Exactly. The averages tell one story, but the extremes, the individual responses, tell us something else, maybe about subtle differences in how they work or who responds best. Let's look at the best case scenario. Kids who had absolutely no prescription worsening, 0 SER progression after 2 years, here there was a significant difference. 38.4% of the kids wearing DIMS had 0 progression. For HAL wearers, it was only 21.9%. And that difference, that nearly double rate for DIMS, was statistically significant.
Whoa, hold on. So with DIMS, you were almost twice as likely in this study to have your kid's prescription completely stabilize over 2 years. That seems like a pretty big deal when you're talking to parents.
It's definitely a striking finding, a major clinical nuance. But, there's always another side to the coin. Let's look at the worst case, the rapid progressors. If we look at kids whose prescription worsened by more than 1.00 diopter, that's quite a lot. The picture flips, especially early on. At the 1-year mark, 8.2% of the DIMS kids were in that rapid progressor group. But for HAL, it was 0%. Nobody.
0%?
0% with HAL had that 1.00D progression at 1 year. And that difference was also statistically significant.
Okay, so now we have a fascinating trade-off emerging. In year 1, HAL seemed to offer total protection against really fast worsening. But over the 2 years, DIMS gave a much better shot at stopping progression altogether. Did that HAL advantage against rapid progression last?
Well, not quite. By the end of the full 2 years, that initial protection from HAL seemed to wear off a bit in that specific category. The numbers actually reversed slightly for the 1.00D group. At 2 years, 16.4% of DIMS kids fell into that category, but for HAL, it was a little higher, 20.5%. So that amazing 0% finding for HAL at year 1 didn't fully carry through to year 2, where the rates were more comparable, maybe even slightly favoring DIMS in that extreme group by then.
This is incredibly useful data. So summing up this part, 2 years, overall averages are the same. But DIMS seems potentially better for hitting a home run, stopping progression entirely, while HAL, especially early on, seemed better at preventing the disaster scenario of very rapid worsening. These are the kinds of subtleties that really help tailor treatment, aren't they?
Exactly. It moves beyond just which lens is better to which lens might be better for this specific patient's risk profile or treatment goals.
Right. Now, let's put this into the wider context. This finding of equivalence, especially in Europe, it kind of contrasts with some earlier studies, particularly out of China, which maybe hinted HAL had an edge over DIMS. Why the difference? Why equivalence here?
Yeah, the researchers behind this study pointed that out, and they did a good job explaining potential reasons. Those earlier comparisons often had methodological challenges. Things like significant differences in the average age of kids in the DIMS versus HAL groups at the start, or very different group sizes, sometimes lots of missing data. And as we discussed, a big one was often the lack of routine cycloplegic refraction during follow-ups. That can really muddy the waters.
So this European study basically cleaned up the methodology.
Pretty much. By ensuring similar baseline characteristics using consistent protocols, including that crucial cycloplegia, they could get a much clearer, more reliable comparison. And that comparison showed equivalence in this population.
That makes sense. Okay, another comparison point. This study reflects real life, being retrospective. How do the actual progression rates seen here compare to the original big clinical trials, the RCTs, like the first DIMS trial?
That's another really important real-world check. The progression seen here was higher than in the initial trials. For DIMS, this study found an average SR increase of Nestle 0.50 diopters over 2 years. The original DIMS RCT reported only none under 0.38 diopters over the same period.
So kids in the real world progressed more than in the controlled trial. Why would that be?
Well, a few reasons. RCTs often have very strict inclusion criteria. They might screen out kids expected to progress very quickly. They're run in specialized settings with, high adherence. But also, and the researchers highlight this, the timing is critical. This study's follow-up period overlaps significantly with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic.
COVID effect.
Exactly. We know the pandemic, with lockdown, increased screen time, less outdoor time, unfortunately accelerated myopia progression globally. So these real-world rates reflect that tougher environmental pressure.
So this study, while maybe showing slightly worse results than the perfect world of an RCT, is actually more valuable for clinicians today because it reflects current reality.
I'd argue yes. RCTs give us the best proof of efficacy under ideal conditions, but they might overestimate the effectiveness you'll see day to day in a regular clinic, especially post-pandemic. This study gives us confidence that even under current conditions, both DIMS and HAL perform similarly well when prescribed in standard European practice. Its generalizability is its strength.
Great point. And what about side effects or problems? Were the lenses well tolerated?
Generally, yes. Minor visual issues were reported by about 6.8% of all participants. Things like non-specific visual disturbances, maybe slight blurriness, especially when first adapting. The good news is, for most kids, this resolved on its own pretty quickly, within days usually. However, they did note 2 cases, one DIMS, one HAL, where these adaptation issues lasted up to a month. So while rare, significant adaptation challenges can happen.
Okay, good to know. Mostly smooth sailing, but occasional bumps.
That sums it up pretty well. So wrapping it all up, what's the bottom line for you, the listener? I think it's really about confidence. We now have solid 2-year data from a European setting showing that DIMS and HAL deliver essentially equivalent results on average for slowing myopia. The choice between them can now be guided by those finer points we discussed, the nuances and progression patterns, maybe patient factors, costs, practitioner experience, things like that. But the core efficacy is comparable.
That's incredibly clarifying. A really practical takeaway. Okay, before we finish, our final provocative thought for you to chew on. We've just heard that real-world progression, influenced by things like the pandemic environment, is higher than initial trials suggested. Spectacle lenses like DIMS and HAL are clearly effective, but they're not a magic bullet against these strong environmental pushes. So the question is, beyond prescribing these advanced lenses, what else should clinicians be strongly advocating for? What public health messages, what lifestyle or environmental strategies do we need to emphasize if we're going to have any hope of pushing back against that daunting 63% myopia prediction? Something to think about beyond the optics. If this deep dive into the data was useful, please do follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
And yeah, if you found this helpful for your understanding or your practice, a 5-star rating would be really appreciated. It helps others find the show.
Absolutely. And as always, you can find a link to the actual study we've been discussing right there in the description. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.